The infamous 737 MAX, the DC-10 of the 21st century. And ironically enough, both jets had 2 incidents and both killed 346 people with their design flaws. But I've never seen a video that explained in detail the science behind the 737 MAX, why Boeing did what they did, and why not do something else like raise the landing gear. So here's my video on it. The 737 started off in 1954 as the Boeing 367-80, the prototype Boeing 707. But the 707 sat between 140 to 220 passengers, which was too big and long range for some of the airline's routes. So Boeing made 2 smaller versions of the plane, the 727 and the 737. Both planes were smaller and better suited for short to medium range flying. Here's a fact that a lot of people don't know. The 737-100 and 200 were actually smaller than the 727. The 737 could seat 85 to 136 passengers, while the 727 could seat 94 to 189 passengers. This is one of the reasons why the 727 had 3 engines, while the 737 had 2 engines. Along with that, the 727 could bypass what we called the 60-minute rule. But this video is long, so I won't be talking about that. Both jets sat at the same height when they were on the ground, meaning airlines could use the same boarding ramps for both jets. They were also built lower to the ground, making it easier to load passengers and freight onto the plane. Both jets used the same Pratt & Whitney JT8D engines, a small engine but sufficient for both planes. So these were the main selling points for both jets and what made them so successful in the first place. With the Airbus A300 in the 1970s, the FAA and the world were slowly accepting twin jets' abilities to fly longer distances. And it had been 17 years since the release of the 737, so it was time for improvements. For the sake of this story, I will only say what is necessary. 2 of those improvements included making them larger, so now the 737 could seat 110 to 189 passengers, which made the 727 extinct, and it came with better engines, the CFM56. But there was an issue. The older JT8Ds were smaller in diameter, so they fit under the wings of the low 737, but the new engines couldn't anymore. So CFM moved the components from underneath the engines to the side, creating the 737's iconic flat engines, increasing the clearance, so now they could fit under the wings. And then in 1997 came the 737NG series, but for the sake of this video, you just need to know the engine size stayed the same as the previous generation. Alright, this is no longer a history lesson, it's now time to explain the MAX. But before I continue on, you need to know these abbreviations first. A320neo, short for Neo Engine Option, and it's obviously the newer A320. A320ceo, short for Current Engine Option, and this is the older model. 737 MAX, this is the newer 737, and the 737NG, short for Next Generation, and is the older model. In 2014, Airbus launched the A320neo. The main highlight were the engines. The neo was powered by the new CFM LEAP 1A engines, making them more efficient than the older generation. So it was time for Boeing to update their 737NG series with the 737 MAX series, which was now powered by the similar CFM LEAP 1B engines. Both planes were a huge hit until the 737 hit the ground too hard in 2018 and 2019. So what happened? The size of the engines had increased again, so even with the flat spots, the engines still couldn't fit under the wings. So to fix this, Boeing moved the engines forward of the wings and then up. So you'll notice when comparing the MAX to the NG, the engines are higher up and further forwards on the MAX. But this also changed the way the plane flies. The engines are very heavy. A 737 has a maximum takeoff weight of 82.6 tons. Each engine weighs 3 tons, 2 of them means 6 tons or 7% of the aircraft's weight. And you can think about this like a seesaw. If I want to balance the seesaw, I hold it at about here. But what happens if I hold it here? As you can see, it falls over because it's not balanced, so I need to hold it at this middle point. This middle point, or the balance point, is what we call the center of gravity. As long as the center of gravity is within my hands, it won't fall over. But what happens if I add weight? If I add weight to just one side, the seesaw falls over to that side. Because by doing so, I've moved the center of gravity closer to that side, and the weight generates a force pushing the seesaw downwards on that side. So now if I want to balance the seesaw, I have to move it closer to that weight. So the heavier one side is, the more I need to move to that side to balance the seesaw. But what is just as important is the placement of that weight. Now I have 2 weights and the seesaw is balanced. But what happens when I move one weight to the other side? Because the weight is further from the center, it generates more force than the one that's closer. So the center of gravity has changed again, and I need to hold it differently in order to balance it. So the heavier one side is, the more the center of gravity moves to that side. And the further away that weight is placed from the center of gravity, the more the center of gravity moves to that side. And a plane is basically just a giant seesaw. We can pitch the plane around its center of gravity. Okay, editor Perm here, and I just realized one small detail I forgot to mention. There are other examples for this, but for this specific case, I will stick with the seesaw. Where the seesaw attaches to to the ground is called the pivot, but on an aircraft, the pivot is just the center of gravity. And if you notice, it's easier to move the seesaw up and down by grabbing it further from the pivot compared to grabbing it close to the pivot. So, the further away the force acts from the pivot, the easier it is to move the seesaw up and down. Just like when you use a wrench, you don't grab it here close to the pivot, you grab it here further away from the pivot because it's easier to rotate the wrench when it's further away from the pivot compared to when it's close to the pivot. And with this information, we all know that wings generate lift, but unless you're flying a B-2 bomber, the wings can only generate lift in one small area. So the question is, if we want to achieve stable flight, where should we place the wings? The answer is right at the center of gravity of the aircraft. Because if the center of gravity is outside the wings, the plane is gonna tilt in that direction. It's just that coincidentally, most planes have their center of gravities at the center of the aircraft. But some planes like the 747, the MD-11, the VC-10 and so on don't have the wings at the center of the plane. Due to the upper deck of the 747, it adds more weight to the front, so the center of gravity is closest to the front, hence the wings are further forward. Meanwhile, on the other planes I mentioned, the engines are placed at the back, adding more weight there, requiring the wings to be placed further to the back. Now, coming back to the MAX, by moving the engines forward, it moved the center of gravity of the plane forwards, so now the plane was off balance. But I don't know what Boeing did. Maybe it was still okay, or maybe they added a counterweight, I'm not very sure. But while this wasn't a big deal, moving the engines forward also caused the plane to pitch upwards. Number one, I'm not sure how this works, but apparently this is the main reason. At high angle of attack, the engine cowlings would act as small wings, generating lift, pushing the nose upwards. But I don't quite understand how this works, but here is my best guess. At high angle of attacks, the engines will become big places of drag. When the air hits the engines, it pushes it upwards. And as we learned earlier, since the force pushing the plane up is further from the center of gravity, this push-up effect is more pronounced on the MAX than it is on the NG. Number two, this is just something I believe happens along with the first point. Most planes have their engines placed under the wings. This causes them to pitch up. Let's take our seesaw diagram and rotate it 90 degrees. When we apply power, it creates a force on this side, pushing the seesaw in the other direction, generating a turning effect. And again, on the MAX, since the engines are further forwards, this turning effect is greater than on the NG. If you paid attention to the wording I've been using, I never said this is a problem or whatnot. And that's because every plane has its own unique quirks and characteristics that make them different to fly. Let's take the DC-10, the A300 and the L1011 for example. Three planes built at similar times and at similar sizes. The A300's engines are mounted underneath the wings, and as we know, this means the plane will pitch upwards. But what about the DC-10? Yes, it has engines under the wings, but it also has this tail-mounted engine that's placed above the center of gravity. So now let's look at our diagram. On the A300, we only have a force acting on one side of the seesaw, but on the DC-10, we have another force acting on the other side, pushing in the opposite direction, pushing the nose down. This means when we apply power on the A300 versus the DC-10, the A300 will pitch upwards while the DC-10 may not pitch up at all. So two very different flying mechanics. What about the L1011 versus the DC-10? Yeah, they're both trijets, but at the same time, the DC-10's engine is placed above the fuselage, while the L1011 is placed inside the fuselage. So, since the DC-10's engine is placed further from the center of gravity, the downwards force generated by the DC-10 is greater than the L1011. Hence, the L1011 won't pitch down as much, but still more than the A300. So this whole pitching up thing with the MAX, it isn't an issue on its own. It's just something the pilots need to get used to. The real problem was the marketing of the plane because of the A320neo. The Neo is marketed as just an updated CEO, meaning if pilots wanted to fly the Neo, they didn't need any retraining or recertification. So, if an airline wants their CEO pilots to fly on a Neo, all they need to do is just spend a little bit of money, have the pilots read through some stuff, and within a month, everyone can now fly a Neo. But with the MAX, they couldn't because the plane now flies differently. So if an airline wants their NG pilots to fly on a MAX, they need to spend a lot of money to have the pilots get retrained, and it would take several months or even years before they could fly a MAX properly. Essentially, upgrading from a CEO to a Neo is like upgrading from an old Hilux to a Neo Hilux. Both are the same vehicle, but this is smoother, more powerful, and more efficient. But changing from an NG to a MAX is like going from a Hilux to a 3-ton lorry. Yeah, they're still cars, but you need to be completely retrained to drive it properly. So here, Boeing was losing out to Airbus. So what was Boeing's solution? They put a software called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS for short. Might crash any second. The idea was when the plane pitched upwards, the software would detect it and push the nose downwards. This would make the MAX feel like the NG. So now, since the MAX feels like the NG, Boeing can now market the plane as just an updated NG. So now, to fly a MAX from an NG, just spend a little bit of money, read through some stuff, and within a month, everyone can now fly on one. And Boeing's argument with the MAX after the crashes was that the software is easy to override. So if anything ever happened, a well-trained NG pilot would disable it by just doing what they would do if it was an NG. This is also why Boeing didn't mention the software when they were marketing the plane, because if they did, they couldn't advertise it as just an updated NG anymore. In the case of the two crashes, Boeing claimed that the pilots weren't as well trained, and that's what led to the crash. But you know what, I won't get into that, you guys can decide for yourself. So, why didn't Boeing just raise the landing gear? Number 1, it wouldn't fit. Here, I built out the Boeing 737's short landing gear, and as you can see, it folds nicely into the fuselage. Now though, I built the exact same model but with the landing gears longer, and as you can see, it doesn't really fit anymore. The landing gear collides with each other, and at the same time, imagine trying to retract all this, it's not going to retract properly. So they would need to redesign the landing gear. And if you've ever seen the wheel well of a Boeing 737, oh my gosh, no, I'm not going to redesign that. Plus, you would have to redesign the wings and the fuselage as well. Number 2, it defeats the marketing of the 737. As we learned from history, the plane was intentionally made lower to the ground to ease maintenance and passenger loading. By raising it up, it defeats the whole purpose. Not to mention, it meant that airlines, especially those like Southwest who have hundreds of 737s, would have to modify their boarding ramps to accommodate a taller 737 MAX and their existing 737 NG. Now let's explore some wildcards that I thought of while sleeping in 2019 when I first learned of this incident. Make the front of the plane heavier by either moving the wings back, making the fuselage longer in the front, or adding more weight on the front. While this would solve the pitch-up issue, it would throw off the balance of the plane like what happened when we moved the engines. Make the back of the plane heavier by either moving the wings forward, making the fuselage longer in the back, or adding more weight in the back. While this would solve the balance issue, it would make the pitch-up effect even worse. Make the landing gear extendable, so when you extended it, it would come out and then extend longer. This could work, but the issue is it's complicated, expensive, needs more maintenance, and again, we'd have to redesign the whole landing gear. I don't work in aerospace, these are just my opinions, so I'm not flaming anyone here. I think the idea with MCAS was good, it just wasn't well executed. Boeing should have either made it clear that MCAS was there or didn't put it in at all. If they didn't put in the MCAS, then sure, you'd run into the issue that airlines would have to retrain their pilots. But at the time, Boeing's reputation were that they were the best airplane manufacturer in the world. And that, along with customer loyalty, meaning airlines like Ryanair only use the 737 for many years, so they know it works and they trust the company. They still buy the 737 MAX despite its drawbacks because of the trust they have in the company. Just like how Toyota can take their old Hilux, use the exact same engine, upgrade the interior and exterior just a little bit, increase the price significantly, and sell it as a brand new car. And guess what? People will still buy it because it's a Toyota. And don't get me started on the 70 series Land Cruiser. But while what Toyota is doing is not good, Boeing could have done the same thing. And the exact same idea with MCAS. If they did put it in, make sure everyone is aware of it and all that. And again, thanks to Boeing's reputation and customer loyalty, the 737 MAX could have still sold very well. And yes, both of these parts would have hurt the sales of the MAX, and the Neo would have definitely overtaken it. But it would still have been better than losing 346 people, the reputation of the company, and God knows how many billions in lawsuits.